I'm Andy Riley. I am the president of the Autism Society of Ohio, the state affiliate, and on behalf of all the autism societies and national, I'd like to welcome you. This presentation is Welcome to Thinking Outside the Behavioral Box, Therapies for Individuals with ASD. I wanted to make sure that you know that if you're here and need contact hours, you check in with Dorothy at the end of the session, and I will be distributing evaluations. And I know people don't like to do evaluations, but it really, really helps us plan for programming next year. So please take a moment to fill them out, and it goes to you. That's what the little hiccup was earlier. So I'd like to introduce our speakers now. Robert Cox. Robert has been working in the field of developmental disabilities for 20 years, and much of that time has been with individuals on the higher end of the autism spectrum. Currently, he works as a service coordinator for the state of Missouri and is working on his MA in mental health counseling. Please help me welcome Robert Cox.
Thank you. I wanted to, is this loud enough for everybody in the back? I tend to be a little loud in here. I also tend to talk quickly, so if I'm going too fast, feel free to slow me down. Raise your hand, just let me know. If you have questions, I consider this kind of an interactive process. I don't mind you throwing a question out. Otherwise, we'll wait till the end and I'll take questions then. I've left plenty of room for that. They changed my title a little bit, so I want to explain to everybody what we're about here so you're not wasting your time, but I feel like we can meet everybody's needs here doing this. You'll see here my title is a little bit different, High Functioning Autism. Much of what I talk about today, though, is sensory needs and sensory need integration, and defining those and meeting those needs, and how that reduces the need for more expensive ABA behavioral therapies. So that is going to be part of the presentation, and if that helps you out, that's great. I just don't want to mislead anybody. We're going to be talking a lot about moderate and severe autism, but we will be talking about it. Many of the kids on my caseload fall in that range. So my idea when I began this was that, as a service coordinator in the field, what I see a lot is if it's not, in fact, in the state of Missouri, if it's not ABA therapies, it's not going to get paid for. And so my idea is to get this out there because with high-functioning individuals and those who are cognitively more capable, I think there are other therapies that are better. I was discussing this with a friend of mine who was very involved in ABA, and his point was that ABA works for everyone. That behavioral methods, you can take the lowest functioning individual, or you can take Albert Einstein and change their behavior with behavioral methods. And of course, he's right about that. But my question to him was, is that all that we can do? When individuals are on the higher cognitive end of the spectrum, we can do more than just change behavior. We begin to teach emotional regulation. And in doing that, we decrease behaviors, we decrease frustration levels, and we start to increase this sense of self-efficacy that you just heard Temple Grandin talk about, because she had people pushing those boundaries for her. When you're a higher cognitive and functioning individual and someone's trying to fit you in a behavioral box, I don't think they're pushing your boundaries hard enough. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yes?
I may ask this the whole question, but since you gave that caveat, I would go ahead and ask my
Go ahead.
But I would hope that you would also be able, or let me know that you can't speak to the fact that oftentimes strictly behavioral approaches also are not able to incorporate underlying trauma that people experience. So particularly people who are cognitively able and older who have experienced a history of trauma, to look specifically at behavior through a specifically behavioral lens and approach, you overlook that, and you actually can do further harm by just, you might change behavior, but you also might do further
And actually in my master's degree, trauma is one of my big things. So I kind of incorporate that into this, in that the method that I choose to focus on here primarily is dialectical behavioral therapy. which is kind of like, it's behavioral, but it also involves that psychodynamic kind of trauma and relational approach to it through the components of validation and mindfulness.
So you'll get.
So we will get there, yes.
Okay, thank you.
There we go. So those of you who are familiar with autism, and most of you here are going to be familiar with autism, are probably familiar with most of these things. The caveat that I would add to this slide is that, there's that, I see it posted all the time, if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It's such a widely varied disorder that I want you to understand as we go through these things that it may apply to some individuals, it may not apply to others. These are things that I commonly see, though, that individuals may see the world differently. Temple Grandin talks about being a visual thinker, seeing things in pictures. We have other types of thinkers, people who do better with mathematics, with logic. Difficulty with abstraction. I had an individual one time that I was not specific enough with. Another individual I heard speaking about autism was relating a story of someone he met who was told by a police officer when he was pulled over, this was a guy with Asperger's, high-functioning autism, "Can I see your driver's license, please?" The individual said no. And then the officer again asked, "Sir, can I see your driver's license, please?" And he laughed and said no. Well, he was arrested. And luckily, they had officers who were trained in dealing with autism. And one of them suggested, "Can you take your license out of your wallet?" Well, of course the officer couldn't see his license because it was in his back pocket. So it's that very literal kind of thinking. He wasn't trying to be rude. It's just in his mind, "No, you can't see my license. Why do you not recognize that?" So motor skills may be compromised. Social functioning in interpersonal relationships, no social filter. This is one of the biggest ones I deal with when I talk to schools, especially, who are very concerned about their funding. And they will refuse often IEPs on the basis of, well, your son doesn't need an IEP. He's very high cognitive functioning. His grades are not suffering. We're going to remove the IEP. Well, they're not seeing the social functioning aspects and how he's not relating to his peers. And that eventually, when we get later, we'll talk about safety and security needs. That really threatens those safety and security needs. Where do I belong in the world? Well, I don't know, because nobody's willing to accept me. And so unless there's someone there to help him move along with those social functioning needs, he's not going to continue doing well in school. And so I've got an individual on my caseload. They pulled the IEP a year ago. And I argued with them, and Mom and Dad argued with them. And sure enough, this year his grades have dropped to where he's not, and he's brilliant. His IQ is probably in the 140s somewhere. He's brilliant. He's capable of making A's. He's not, because nobody's addressing those social needs. Motor skills may be compromised. We'll talk about how you can have proprioceptive issues, which means I don't know where I am in space, kind of thing relating to the world around you, or vestibular issues, which are about balance, and obsessive behaviors and interests, perseveration. I have an individual on my caseload who knows everything about military history, everything about the machinery that was used. And he goes to these reenactment places and to seminars on World War II, and people gather around him to listen to him speak about these things because he knows that much about it. And he perseverates on it. So one thing we did with him was we talked about one thing that the rules-bound kind of affect of individuals with autism, very rules-bound. If it's a rule, I'm going to follow it. That's how it is. So I suggested to his mother, because he would talk on and on and on and on and on about one piece of weaponry, and nobody really wanted to hear that for 30 minutes. So I suggested to Mom, get him a watch, tell him he has 10 minutes to talk about what he wants to talk about, and then he has to ask the other person a question. And you can prepare that question ahead of time, so he's not going to do that. Works really well, because it's the 10-minute rule for him. I have 10 minutes. He will even, you can catch him looking at his watch every now and then when he's talking. So, the strong reactions to stimulus and sensory input often leads to emotional dysregulation and problem behaviors. I was just talking with Dot earlier about her grandson, who is low-functioning autism at the age of 17, and also, just coming through puberty and probably experiencing all the same frustrations with hormone imbalance that the rest of us did at that age, but can't communicate those things. He will communicate those things. He won't communicate them verbally because he's not capable of that. He will communicate them through self-harm and through becoming agitated and angry. And it's up to us to figure out what that communication means. So a lot of these techniques that I'm going to talk about, meeting the sensory needs, noticing what they like, that kind of thing, can be used to lower that frustration level. So problem behaviors, like I said, can be very different from person to person. We can have aggression problems. Again, may not be in all people, but I've seen some pretty serious aggression problems in some individuals. And that is a form of communication. You know, one thing ABA individuals will tell you is that every behavior is a form of communication about something. We talked about the obsessive behaviors, the perseveration on specific things. We talked about stimming and self-soothing and educating professionals. This is one of our biggest jobs, I think, as advocates for people with autism. I have an individual on my caseload who is 22 years old, and he's been an IV meth user for a long time. One of my specialties is also in the addiction field, so they gave me the caseload. This individual also has ADHD, and not to go too deeply into that, but it's incredibly common for people with ADHD to also end up being meth users because the methamphetamine is a very strong psychostimulant and it calms them down, they can focus. And when you add the autism component to that, wow, that's a great drug. You know? So this is why I have more than one individual on my caseload who is high-functioning autism and a methamphetamine user. So he ends up in rehab, and they want to kick him out after just less than a week. And they call me because I'm his case manager, and they say, he's not doing well in groups, and this is mostly a group-based recovery process. I said, what makes you think he's not doing well? He's manic. I said, is he diagnosed bipolar? Has he exhibited mania? They said, well, he paces constantly in the back of the room. I said, he's not manic, he's stimming. He's self-soothing. She wanted to argue with me about it, and I said, look, give him a week. You know, he didn't last a week because he got tired of people not understanding who he was and being a social outcast, and he left. But he's doing great now. He's clean 6 months because he's living with his parents, and we set up those sensory needs kind of things in home for him that he needed. And so he no longer needed all of the meth to deal with the anxiety and stuff. So I told him, when you get to a year, steak dinner on me. But he was just self-soothing. You know, what she didn't understand was that he was going to come to her in a week or a week and a half and want to talk to her about things he'd heard in group, because he had been listening that entire time, because the pacing was calming him down enough that he could pay attention to what was going on. So we really need to educate people in just being able to exist in the same space as individuals with autism, instead of demanding that the individuals with autism learn to exist in space with them. It's got to go both ways. Other symptoms you might see, I talked about the ADHD, that's pretty common. Anxiety, Temple talked about anxiety, that's a really common problem with autism because it is like all of this input at one time and no way to filter it out. And that's going to create anxiety. Sensory motor integration, which is a result really of vestibular and proprioceptive issues, not knowing where I am in space, not realizing that gravity works all the time, things like that. High pain threshold. I have a young kid on my caseload who likes the feeling of heat, but he doesn't register pain really well. So mom has to watch him so he doesn't run over to a tea kettle and hold his hand over it for 3 or 4 minutes and end up with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Maybe over or under sensitive to sensory input. And we'll talk about a little bit in a minute about those different kinds of reactions to sensory input. May have a lack of fear to dangerous situations. This is why recently in my state, in my area, we had a young kiddo at 5 years old who was an escape artist, as many are, get out of his home, had no sense of danger, wandered off to the neighbor's swimming pool, had a fascination with water that was one of his sensory issues, jumped in and drowned. He had no sense of danger. That's something that has to be taught, and it takes a lot of time.
Excuse me.
Yes?
I'm one of those people who, it doesn't make as much sense if I hold my questions to the end, so when
No,
I
it's okay.
start asking too many.
It's okay.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could share a little bit, you shared in other resources, when you're dealing with other professionals and they're not understanding things, for example, that might look like self-abusive behavior, when in fact the person is doing physical things that create sensory, but they don't have a pain threshold.
That's a great question. I have a,
How do you educate people around that?
and you'd be surprised who you have to educate about
Yeah.
that. I have a great example of that. In that I had a child on my caseload who is 11 years old, and I was going to talk about him a little later. I'll talk about him now, though. He was an exceptional case, moderate to high functioning. I think he's much higher functioning than anyone's given him credit for thus far. I think it's just that his sensory needs have not been met. But he requires 24-hour a day, 7-day an hour a day monitoring, and he was not getting that at home. He, you know, they live at just above the poverty level of that, and mom's got to work a full-time job, dad's got a full-time job, and nobody wants to watch this kid because there's such serious issues. One of the things he's fascinated with is fire, and one of those times that he couldn't be monitored every minute, he went in and set a mattress on fire. He burned down his apartment and the one next door. So these were serious situations. So we set up a situation that had never been done in my state before. I brokered a deal with another division in the Department of Mental Health so that we could come together and pay for this kid to have a 24-hour a day, 7-day-a-week placement, just on his own, in his own apartment, with wonderful people that I know to do great work. And in 3 months, he's not been hospitalized for self-harm once, because his attentional needs are being met. But one of the things that I found when I sat in an IEP with him was they wanted to remove him from the classroom because they weren't prepared to deal with his level of self-harming behaviors. And so I asked specifically, what is his self-harming behavior? Well, every time he gets frustrated, he jams his fingers in his ear really hard. Well, he's not self-harming. He's trying to filter out the noise in that classroom. So how about we try taking him out of the classroom into a quiet space for 15 or 20 minutes to reduce those needs? You know, so that is one of the things we face, even at the level where this is in a SPED program at a high school. You should understand this. You know, so the education part is really, really important.
I have a question as well, kind of along the same lines.
Sure.
I have a client who has difficulty with attraction. She's 9. A particular instance that I have a very hard time, and I'm kind of looking for tips about how to convey this information to parents and other professionals. We were crossing the street. I said, "Are there any cars coming?" She said, "No." Stepped out into the street. There was a truck coming.
Right.
She didn't generalize cars and trucks.
So you have to change the question to, is there anything coming that might squash you?
Yes.
Right.
Because we talked about
You know.
very specifics, like if you step out in front of something that is moving toward you, you will get squished.
And part of the
you will be
problem with trying to educate the people around them is that it requires a paradigm change for them too.
hurt. Absolutely.
You know, to be able to think like you requires me to stop thinking like me for a minute. And that's not an easy thing to do. As human beings, we are very rooted in habit. The ABA part was put together by a friend of mine, Sarah Kovac. She works at the Family's First Center for Autism. We used to present this together, and she just couldn't take off work. The ABA recently changed their rules about how many cases an individual can carry on their caseload. And so she got really busy really quick, taking on extra cases. But she put together these slides for the most part, and so there are 2 main goals in ABA programming for children and youth: skill acquisition and behavior either reduction or increase. So we want to increase positive behaviors and reduce negative behaviors. Both goals contribute to the desired outcomes, that we're looking for functional appropriate behaviors so that we can move towards independent living. Great goals. And like I said, ABA is incredibly effective with low and moderate functioning individuals. And with kids who are, I would say, if under 16, maybe you stay with the ABA methods if you're having behavioral problems, but you need to meet the sensory needs first. We'll talk about that later. Part of the thing going on in the state where I constantly am trying to provide services for individuals, and one thing we look at is, you know, mom's been told, well, he needs ABA therapy. Okay. Are you meeting his sensory needs? Well, what's that? So then we go into talking about sensory needs, and we find that when we meet those sensory needs, and the research is beginning to bear that out, there's not a lot of research out there yet because it's really being opposed by the ABA industry. But it is squeaking through, and what it is showing is that if we begin meeting sensory needs, we reduce the need for behavioral supports, which makes sense. If we're meeting their sensory needs, we're hearing their communication, they're not frustrated, they don't feel like acting out to try and be heard. So, within each domain, they break it up into very specific skills. So an ABA therapist may come into your house and they want to train the kid to speak, for instance, in the language domain. They're going to break it up into two components: expressive communication and receptive communication. So if I hand you a picture of an apple and I say apple, can you say apple? Apple. And, very good. And then if I had a reward, I would give you one right now. And in receptive communication, you might lay out pictures and you might say, show me the picture of the apple. Show me the picture of your mother. There's two very different areas of processing, Brokaw's and Wernicke's areas of the brain. And so we exercise those areas and we reinforce correct answers and we ignore wrong answers and keep going over it until we can reinforce the correct answers. It's a very simple system. It is very effective. So they also focus on behavior reduction. Many children with autism engage in behaviors that impede their abilities to learn, participate in the community. I have individuals on my caseload. Generally, it looks like this from the ABA perspective, has been my experience. When you have a 16-year-old who's also going through puberty and developmental stage problems and has behavioral issues, ABA services will come in and do what's called a functional behavioral analysis. They'll take a look at the individual's behavior in the environment, and they'll set down a very structured routine, which is basically a token economy or some version of that, whereby the individual can earn points to gain the reward they want with appropriate behaviors. Again, works very well with moderate and even sometimes low-functioning individuals, but I think we can do better with the high-functioning
I have a question about that. It's going to sound like I'm reiterating my earlier question, but I'm just a little concerned that if we keep using that high-low functioning paradigm, that even in this conversation, we're still missing the mark on the fact that, let's say someone actually has an experience that is a trigger from a traumatic event. So the antecedent really is the trigger and the flashback, and not the event that caused the trigger. If we set up a behavior plan that assumes the antecedent is what was observed, not only do we not address the issue, but we also may re-traumatize the person. And I was kind of hoping you might be speaking to that a little bit when I read your description.
And again, when we get to the DBT part, we're going to cover a lot of that.
Okay, all right.
But what I would say right now to that is that I'm not a behaviorist, but my perception is that you can't really treat trauma. You can, I will say this in defense of behaviorism, as my friend said, you can change the behavior of anyone. But what are you doing, what are the undercurrents of that?
Yeah, and that's the...
What's going on underneath that? When you change that behavior, okay, I've changed the behavior, I've made it more socially acceptable, I've made it so that it can exist in society, but when they go home at night and they have to exist in their own environment, then what? So what I'm looking at is trying to make the life fuller, so that I have a richer emotional experience in life, whether I'm in the community and acting appropriately, or I'm at home and just having to sit quietly with myself for 5 minutes. And I think that the mindfulness component of DBT really exceptionally helpful in that kind of situation. So some of the strengths and limits we've talked about a little bit before. I I think it's very good at changing behaviors in moderate and low functioning, or even very young individuals. I think that in-home ABA services, like I talked about, are about going in and looking at the environment, what's working, what's not working, and structuring it. And those things work very well. But I don't think that gets, as we talked earlier, at the emotional level of what's going on in higher functioning individuals. I don't think it deals effectively as we could with anxiety. Yes, we're changing the behavior. Yes, we can change the behavior. But are we dealing with what the root cause of that behavior was? Or are we just asking people to stuff that down and do what they're supposed to be doing to be socially acceptable? So there is a great deal of evidence, and one study I've cited here that I found fascinating was that brain plasticity and mindfulness go hand in hand. We've done a lot of research on the ability now to change the actual structure of the brain and to reroute the way we think, the way we respond, at a very deep emotional level that's even pre-verbal, precognitive. So mindfulness has been shown to cause an increase in executive control. And it creates the ability for metacognition in a lot of cases, thinking about thinking. What am I thinking? What is that doing to me? How am I feeling in the root? What's going on in the moment? So I'll talk a little bit now about sensory needs and diets, and this applies across the spectrum, really, and identifying those needs. And online, if you find my presentation on the Autism Society's online site, I uploaded a list of sensory needs it's like a 3-page list that parents can just go through and check off. Oh, he likes doing this, he doesn't like doing that, and how is that sensory need being defined? It's a really good way to define those sensory needs, and then we can start approaching them.
You say this is online?
Yeah, well, there's the page with the sensory needs, the 3-page, it's just a 3-page list. And if you just Google identifying sensory needs, checklist, you'll pop up several. This was just one that I got from one of my parents who I thought was really good. So I posted it along with the presentation. So there are basically 3 types of sensory reactivity that fall in 2 categories. The first category is underreactive. These are the kids that are kind of lethargic. They don't seem to have a lot of energy. They're not really involved in anything. You'll catch them in the classroom sleeping with their heads on the desk. They don't seem to respond a lot to what's going on. They prefer to sleep most of the day away. These are underreactive individuals, and they are also underreactive individuals are individuals who are constantly touching things. So this is the second category of underreactive. The kids who are touching the walls, they're playing with the chandeliers, I've got the kid who I talked about earlier who started fires, also likes to put a wet towel in a toaster because it sizzles, you know? He loves that sizzle sound. So these are seekers. These are kids that aren't getting enough sensory input, so they're going out and looking for that sensory input elsewhere. The other type is overreactive, and this is the ones we hear about most often in the media. This is the kind of sensory individual that Temple Grandin is, very overreactive to stimulus. And I went and listened to Aaron Likens speak. He's with Easter Seals Foundation Midwest, and he goes and speaks as an individual with Asperger's about what it's like living with that. And he described this as living life unfiltered. And everything's coming in. Just imagine, if I'm tapping my fingers the rest of this seminar, how many of you are not going to be able to filter that out?
I would literally have to leave.
Yeah, okay? And take that with every other little tiny noise, the buzz of the air conditioners. One of the individuals, the gentleman that was using methamphetamine that I spoke about earlier, was very overreactive. He could hear outside his apartment, with all the windows closed, he could hear the power lines coming. His parents were amazed by that when I asked him that question. I said, how reactive are you? to noise. And he said, well, I hear this and this, and it really bothers me, I can't filter it out. I said, can you hear power lines? And he said, yeah, it's like a high whine. And I'm like, yep. So, and he can't filter this out. So, there are a couple of issues that people have, vestibular problems, which are like gravity issues, and proprioceptive problems, which is like, where do I end and the world begins? I had an individual on my caseload. I've been with him 15 years, off and on. I started doing direct care with him 15 years ago. And when I first started with him, he was terrified of dark rooms, so he would not go in a movie theater unless you went in the floor of the bed, and escalators. Because it was very difficult to decide, the stair changes, And so it was he's already got these proprioceptive issues about where do I end and the rest of the space starts, and now you change space on him. We met that, 6 months it took. And after 6 months, he didn't want to go anywhere when I worked with him except to go ride the escalator at Crimson. But we started, and we worked in very, very small increments. You have to work at their level. One of the better things I heard Temple say was that you push too hard and they go into overload. And it's a lot like dealing with trauma. You push people too hard and they're gone. They dissociate really quickly.
And then the meltdown gets a behavior.
Yeah, so, but that's that dissociation. They just go. They're gone. You push too hard. So you have to work really, really slow. For the first 2 or 3 weeks, all we did was go in and look at the escalator and talk about how cool it was. And we'd take the elevator up and we'd watch it from the top and talk about how cool it was. And then after that, we'd go approach it, maybe touch it. And it was just really slow kind of integration into his world so that he could decide where space stopped and he started and that he was going to be okay. It's really about making him feel okay so he doesn't go into sensory overload. And that's one of those important features, too, of dealing with both trauma and autism, is that we need to make sure the individual feels safe. The minute they don't feel safe, they're gone. They're in meltdown mode, they're sticking their fingers in their ears, they're running away, they're doing whatever they need to do to feel safe in the world. So what we create is a sensory diet. What is a sensory diet? Most of you have heard about sensory diets. There's more and more evidence they work, but basically it's a short timeout. They don't like the word timeout in my state because that implies that you are infringing on someone's rights. So we'll call it a sensory break. We give them a 10-minute sensory break every hour where they can go meet their own needs. Maybe they really like fuzzy, soft things. So they keep a little fuzzy, soft ball in their pocket. And even when they're out in the community, if they're feeling stressed, they can reach in and grab that and start to play with it and start to meet that sensory need. Maybe there's a place where they can have 10 minutes. We talk about individuals getting employment. One of the things we need to do is learn how to help individuals adapt to their employment environment. So if you are working at a computer firm where you're expected to work 8 hours a day, the great thing is every 2 hours, OSHA says you get a 10 or 15-minute break. So you set up your little sensory space in your office or wherever you need to go, and for that 10 or 15 minutes, you are there, meeting those sensory needs. Okay? I talked about educating people in IEPs, educating schools about sensory breaks. It's amazing how many schools I've worked with that did not integrate sensory breaks into the classroom, but wanted to complain in the IEP meetings about the behaviors of that child. Don't complain about the behaviors of the child if you're not integrating the sensory breaks they need to keep those behaviors from occurring, because I promise you, if they have a need and it's not being met, just like you and me, they're going to find a way to get you to meet that need. So, we talk about lowering or raising the baseline stimulation to manage other needs, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but really this is where mindfulness techniques can help, is that we begin to lower that stress and anxiety level. Temple talked about taking medication, that when she lowered that anxiety level, life became manageable. We can also do that, we're finding really effectively, with mindfulness techniques.
Have you seen a, to say this can take more, what do you say? I know that there's already been evidence that shows that many people on the spectrum, I actually check myself, that I register cognitively much more slowly what's happening physiologically. So I could be already at a 5 before I've registered that my stress level is going up sensory environment. Are you seeing that as people are more aware of mindfulness, are you seeing that people are able to
That's
become
why we
more
do
self-aware?
mindfulness from a sensory integration perspective.
Got it, okay, so that's where you're going.
Because we start with being mindful about things like handing them something, it's in their hands, and let's explore how this feels. So that we begin to,
Is there research?
There is some research, that, again, there's not a lot of research, it's increasing. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today, is I want to push for that research.
Okay.
I want that done. Because, you know, one of my arguments with an ABA guy on a radio show in my town in Kansas City was, he said, well, we need to stick with evidence-based approaches. I hear that a lot from ABA, evidence-based, evidence-based. And I said, that's great, you're absolutely right. I don't want to put anything out there that is not an evidence-based approach, but it will never be evidence-based if we don't fund the research.
Yeah, people can self-report.
Yeah.
So more than happy.
Well, but then what they're going to hear from self-reporters is that it wasn't a structured environment, the study wasn't set up right, that it's basically just self-report.
No, I mean,
So-
you do the research and you have people in the research studies who do the self-report.
Right.
They'll simply validate what they've been self-reporting on and now they'll do it in a research.
Right. So, I mean, that's, but the thing is getting the funding for the research. And so that's, I keep hearing evidence-based, and it's a catch-22 because nobody wants to fund research that is not evidenced to be effective, but you can't evidence something to be effective without the research. So this is the fight that we're fighting. The other interesting thing that I found in some of my research was that the behavioral sensory link, we know it's out there. A lot of research out there about the link between behavior and sensory integration problems. But it's highest, like, I don't remember what the exact quote was out of this study. It was like 8 times higher in kids with auditory sensory issues, which fascinated me.
So, quick question, I've got a client who is 6 and he has a lot of auditory defensiveness and sensory issues, avoidance, not seeking. One of his ways of self-regulating is to recite things and to write the alphabet in the air with his fingers.
Does it help him to hear those things recited to him?
No. No, once
It was
it's,
that idea.
if you try to do that.
Okay.
But school has been treating this as a STEM and they want to stop.
Yeah.
So how do you?
We're back to the education part.
Yeah.
You know, even with schools, we're back to the education part. And maybe the middle ground there is that we start giving him sensory breaks every hour of 10 minutes where he can go do whatever he needs to do to meet his own sensory needs. And you can label it whatever you want to label it, but I promise when you find that he's focusing the other 40 minutes of that class time, you're going to be okay with it.
Yeah, I suggested that and they made him work for those breaks. Yeah.
That's because we need to use the evidence-based approach somewhere in there, you know, the ABA, where you're going to... Yeah, and I've run into that before too. I have a client and her therapist, actually her therapist said she wants to talk about boys. Well, she's 16, she's going to want to talk about boys. And she's high-functioning autism, so she's going to perseverate on the issue of boys in fashion. That's where she is. But she said, she told her that if she would work the first 30 minutes of the session with her, then she would give her 15 minutes. I said, no, you've got to front load that. Or she's going to sit there and all she's going to think about the whole time is 25 minutes and I get to talk about boys, you know?
Also, why not use the interest? Why not use what she's spewing to create the context of the therapeutic environment? Isn't that what you do with other people?
Pretty much. But see, again, we're focusing on what's wrong instead of what's right. What's not working with the client instead of what's not working with me as a therapist. So, you first and then you had a question.
I think
I'm sorry.
I think the best way to educate on that is to teach that if you take away what people like to label as a STEM behavior, they're going to replace it with something else, and a lot of times it's worse than what you're dealing with initially.
They're going to replace it, or they're going to sit around and perseverate about it until they decide to have a meltdown.
Right, and I mean, I had a little boy who started having seizures because they took away him biting his thumb. So he started holding his breath and actually throwing himself into seizures.
Right.
So that, to me, is the best example of don't touch it. If you want to replace it, try to replace it, but never take it away.
That's what I was saying earlier, that if you're not going to meet those needs, they're going to find a way to do it or to make you do it. One of
And
the
I
two.
think that's the best education, though. You have to give that
Right.
home example of it.
Yeah. And your question, I'm sorry.
Well, I would say with my son had to distinguish between the two types of behavior modification type activities. One we group as sensory break type stuff, and then others was the motivational. You want to.
You've got to make sure the sensory stuff comes first,
Yeah.
or he's not going to focus on the motivation. So I stole this with permission from two guys that call themselves the Asperger's experts, and they're fantastic. Danny Ray and Hayden Mears. They've got a website out there, it's listed below. And when I saw this, I mean, any of you who are into psychology are going to think, oh, that's Maslow upside down. You know? And so you'll recognize my next slide. But essentially what they're saying is right on the money, that if you don't meet the sensory needs, you're going to have more of the behavioral needs and those comorbidities like the obsession, the perseveration, the OCD type behaviors. Those are going to get worse. You have to meet those sensory needs first and lower that threshold of stimulation and lower that kind of life unfiltered effect.
Or allow for stimulation. The person trying to add
Right.
to the environment.
Exactly. You may need to increase
It's
the
no
level of
different than
stimulation.
somebody who shakes their foot.
Right.
This is not as noticeable as when you shake your foot.
Right. And some people, those would be the sensory seekers. And in that case, part of meeting those sensory needs is providing the stimulation rather than doing it. So, and if you meet the if you don't work on things like OCD and anxiety, once you've met these sensory needs, you're not going to get to the social functioning part. But what do we do with 16, 17-year-old kids who have social functioning problems? We go tell them how to behave, how to say hi, you know, how to be appropriate when you shake hands. And we don't teach them anything else. So they may go through that just to get through it with you, but all they're thinking about is, I need a break, I need a break, I need a break, I need a break. So, you recognize my next slide then. We talk about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that if the safety needs are not met, why I decided to do that. If the safety needs are not being met, we're not going to move up to those other needs. You know, esteem. Learning and developing that sense of I can do in the world for myself is the primary vehicle for self-esteem. You know, it's what self-efficacy is all about, learning that I can be effective in my world. We're not going to get there if we're worried constantly about, am I safe in my environment? And this is where the trauma part comes in. You know, if you've got a kid who's dual diagnosis, who has trauma in his background and autism, this becomes even more important. You have to make them feel safe in their world first. And we don't get to those other issues, the social skills. How do I relate to the world? What do I want from my world? You know, part of my job as a service coordinator is to sit in a meeting and ask a kid, one of the questions that we ask them, what do you dream about doing? If these other needs aren't met, he's just going to give me a blank stare. You know, what do you mean? What do I dream about having my sensory needs. I dream about living in the world and not feeling like it's going to overwhelm me every 5 seconds. You know, so if we're not meeting those base needs, we're not going to be able to advance. So now we're at the high-functioning autism part. Effective therapies that have been CBT. There's a good deal of research out there about cognitive behavioral therapy and its effectiveness with high-functioning individuals and autism. Part of that is just really knowing the individual and defining what works for them and going from there. But what we know is that the cognitive abilities of individuals with high-functioning autism, even as low as 12 years old, are no different than neurotypical individuals. The cognitive abilities are the same. Why shouldn't our treatment be the same? You know, the emotional regulation part is not there. But you know, in patients with severe mental illness with things like borderline personality disorder, there's a real struggle for emotional regulation there. Do we suggest the only therapy that would work for them is ABA? I don't think so. You know, there are a lot of people out there that have problems with emotional regulation besides the autistic population. So when we're dealing with a high-functioning population and the cognitive aspects are the same, why not use some of those advanced therapies? So we start with things like paying attention to, like we said, how it feels this, and that you're right, there's a longer period of recognition, that I'm gonna start feeling bad, but it's gonna take me a while to process that I'm feeling bad. So the difference there is that we start smaller. We go in smaller steps. You know, they're not gonna be able to go as quickly, you're gonna lose them more quickly. But part of being in a therapy room with an individual is knowing that individual, is knowing what their abilities are. And you may not know that in session 1 or session 2. But you will notice after a while that when you start doing this one certain thing, they go bye-bye. You know, they're gone. And so we start with that kind of expanding that window for regulation, self-regulation. And a good way to do this is with mindfulness techniques. DBT is the therapy that I really like to say will work with individuals who are high functioning because we add several components. It's basically CBT techniques, but we add a component of mindfulness practices, and we add the validation component. Now, when I called around in my state to every big autism research outfit out there who was doing therapies with kids who were autistic, and asked them, are you doing DBT with them? No. Are you doing mindfulness? No. Well, what do you do with them? Well, we do CBT therapies, and we teach them some breathing exercises. And you're doing mindfulness, and you're basically doing DBT. You just need to add that validation component, and you're about there. So, I also believe that once we get to, and these are steps, again, it's going to take a long time. This is not a small, short-term effort that we're making here. So as we make these steps, and we've begun to teach the emotional regulation, we've begun to teach the being able to breathe through things and not go into meltdown right away, we can also begin to add some of the emotion-focused therapies and integrate that with the mindfulness techniques and becoming aware of what I'm feeling earlier. So we talked about the ability of metacognition is high in high-functioning individuals, that CBT has been shown very effective in controlling anger and reactivity in Asperger's patients, that it is effective in treating the anxiety induced by, we know that CBT works to treat anxiety in the normal population. It's one of the recommended methods for treating, in the therapy room, for treating OCD disorders and anxiety disorders, and why wouldn't it be in high-functioning autism also, the recommended therapy? And again, this is the research that I did with the cognitive abilities of high-functioning individuals is equivalent to neurotypical kids in the same age range. There are repeated studies that show that. So the DBT therapies are very directed at skills training because, like I said earlier, it is a behavioral therapy. Much of what we want to teach are interpersonal skills. Then you add, like I said, the validation component and the mindfulness component. Specific techniques, I'm going to kind of go through these. If you have questions, we can stop and go back. Looks like I'm pushing my time here. So specific techniques, they like to use shorter terms here. So they use DEARMAN, which means describe, express, assert, reinforce, be mindful, appear confident, and negotiate. This is an interpersonal skills training. This is a way that we train individuals to, get what they want in the world and behave in the business world. This was a therapy that wasn't around when Temple Grandin was around, so her mother was teaching her these things with the parties, with the board games. To describe what you want, to express that in an acceptable way, to assert yourself but not be aggressive or angry. To reinforce the other individual when they're getting what you're saying, reinforce that. That's exactly what I mean, thank you. To be mindful of what's going on inside, to appear confident in what you're saying, and to be able to negotiate. Negotiate is a big tool for kids with Asperger's, because when you're in that world, it's because you're a very literal thinker, everybody should see what you see. And if they don't see what you see, there's something wrong with that. So negotiation is a big skill to teach there. Getting what you want without destroying a relationship involves being gentle, being interested in the other person. You can talk for 10 minutes. When 10 minutes is up, you ask them a question that brings them into the conversation. Validate the other individual, we talked about. Have an easy manner. Don't go from 0 to angry really quick because they're not getting your point. Be patient with the other individual if you would like them to be patient with you. These are all skills that can be taught. The validation component is very important, I think, and it works with borderline personality disorder patients, and I think it would work very well with patients with autism. How many of you in here have kiddos with autism who are pariahs in their school environment? How many of them feel awkward and won't interact because they're socially not accepted? Okay, so the validation of the experience is very important. It says to them that, I know what you're going through. The quickest way to build a relationship with someone is to understand them. The quickest way to make them feel safe and trust you is to build relationship. So when I say to you, I understand what you're going through, I know that you're not socially accepted, I'm here to help you work so that you can be more involved in your environment. That's a big step. So we validate the coping tools too. It may look weird for you, but it works. This is where we have to educate about not getting rid of the stemming behaviors because they work, even though they look funny. And we need to educate. And we can find alternatives. Like I said, if someone's into plushy toys, stick one in your pocket. If you're in a situation, if you're in Walmart with mom, if you're wherever and you're getting overloaded, but feeling something soft calms you down, stick it in your pocket. There's this whole brushing protocol out there with some of the sensory integration work, and it really works for a lot of kids. They like that tactile kind of brushing, So brush your hair. It's acceptable in public. So there are ways. We just have to be creative in meeting those needs. And the last is validating the trauma and pain. And that includes knowing your client. Knowing if there's more than autism going on. And validating it.
Do you find that the awareness that even amongst justice whole question?
That's all right, go ahead.
Do you find that as there's some awareness or more awareness that even for folks who have a diagnosis of borderline, wouldn't be developed, that there's actually underlying trauma for most people who end up with that age? Do you think that that's helping people recognize how to be mindful
With
about
people who end up with a borderline diagnosis?
there's often trauma?
Oh, yeah.
And there's an
I mean, that's
awareness of
like-
that. So my question is, now that that's better understood, are
Right.
you finding that there's more practitioners able to use DBT and CBT and stay aware? Or are we still needing people to become more skilled?
I think when you talk about DBT, I don't think so much with CBT because you haven't integrated the whole mindfulness
Right.
component. And one thing about a therapist who is teaching mindfulness is they've probably been practicing that themselves. So I don't want to get off the subject and discuss therapies and the fact that we're becoming more aware of like the countertransference issues and all that jazz, and we're more aware of self.
I'm just concerned
So we're
with
watching for what's
practitioners
going on
having the
in
skills to do what you're saying work.
I think DBT therapists probably are more
Okay,
adept because of that mindfulness component.
okay.
And because I know what it means to be mindful, it's easier for me to lead you through being
Okay.
mindful. So, mindfulness training really is about calming the storm before the reaction to the stress. And it's going to take time. Because like you said, we're dealing with a smaller regulation window. They use improve, means creative imagery that you can do once. And again, these are techniques that we can use when we've met those sensory needs, when we've begun to regulate that, when we've taught the individual to begin regulating that. We can start teaching them that when you're feeling this sensory overload come on, you can begin going to a place with imagery. You can find meaning in the situation. It doesn't feel good right now, but here's what I'm going to get for it. There's meaning in that situation. Prayer, relaxation, meditation, you can do that as you're walking through Walmart. If you're taught to. Take that mental vacation, keep encouraging yourself, I'm only in this loud Walmart with mom for 10 minutes, I can make it through. So a lot of that involves returning to the moment, to the present, where I am here and now, And just starting with simple things like, let's take this plushie, or let's take this, if they're into harder things. I had a kid that was into Rubik's Cubes for some reason. He liked the colors and he liked the hard texture. So let's really just sit and explore this Rubik's Cube for a moment and just look at the colors and get involved with the textures and how it feels. And when I do that with him, I'm training him to move his focus from everything out here to that one thing, with the hope that eventually he will be able to transfer that skill to any one thing. That eventually he'll be able to look down at his hand and start to notice the lines in his hand when he's in Walmart, and be into that enough that he takes himself out of the sensory overload before it occurs. So the other thing we can do is begin paying attention to those objects in the outer world. If things are becoming too stimulating for me all at once, I pick a few things I can focus on with this training. You know, I can focus on the shiny silver cart and describe that inside my head. You know, I can begin shifting my focus from the many to the one. It takes a lot of time and a lot of training. So, and part of recognizing the sensory overload is being able to recognize and dissect, you know, what's going on with the sensory overload. And there's a technique in CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy called chaining. And I use this with an addict, and I'll use that as an example, but I think it would apply to autism too. I had an addict on my caseload who said one day, I don't know what happened, I was having a great day, I was really happy, I went to work on a car, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was drunk and cussing my girlfriend and her kids and storming out, and I hate that. Well, most of you know it didn't just go from A to B. So chaining is looking at what happened through the day and connecting those points, and this was about trauma. This was about, okay, where did you start on the car? Well, I started at the back, there was a light that needed to be fixed, I was going to pull it off. So tell me about taking off the light. It was frustrating, I couldn't get it off. And what were you feeling when that was going on? I was tense. How were you tense? Well, I could feel my whole body tighten, and I looked over my shoulder all the time. Why did you look over your shoulder all the time? I was expecting my father to be there. Okay, so we changed to the point where he realizes that every time he didn't get something right when he was working in the shop with his father would pick up a wrench and beat him senseless with it. So, you know, this is the same thing with autism kids. Not that all of them have this kind of trauma, but they all, if we change, okay, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? We start to gain that awareness a little at a time of what's going on inside my body as this overload develops. And like you said, it's going to take longer, but I believe it still can be done. In doing that, we begin to prepare for the overload. First, we lower this, we identify our sensory needs, we begin lowering stress levels with that, and we begin preparing for the overload. So that I feel, gosh, you know, I'm feeling tense, and I've worked with my therapist, and I realize when I'm feeling tense, that probably means something's not going right. What is it? And you can identify it. I just need a sensory break. So I'm going to tell Mom I'm going to go sit in the car for a while. I have an individual on my caseload who is 26 years old. He's working in a sheltered workshop, and he should not be. That's another issue. He's very high functioning. Part of the problem was, part of the mandate for sheltered workshops in my state is that if an individual is capable of being employed in the community outside of that workshop, you need to provide them with the transition services to do that.
Amen.
But they did such a bad job that people were constantly coming up to him at work saying, what's wrong with you? And he was so embarrassed and so traumatized by that, he had no interest. I have talked to him, what if we used another employment agency that would be able to explain, no, don't want to do it, I'll just stay at the workshop, I'm fine. So it's going to take a long time to overcome that. I think we can. You know, in my role as a service coordinator, it's not really my job but I have referred him to some really good therapists, and he has signed releases that I can talk to him about these things with. So hopefully we'll make progress in that area. But that, you know, that one thing his parents noticed early on was that he liked heavy metal music. And he liked to sit with headphones on and bang his head to heavy metal music. And these are great parents who don't know why something works, but they know it does work for their kid. And so it's like, well, let's keep doing that. Because they're paying attention. They're just not saying, stop, 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 stop. They're paying attention to what gets him to stop. So all they knew was that he was headbanging for 15 minutes, and he would leave for work, and they would get no calls from his work that they had any problems all day long. And he would come home, and they would let him headbang for 15 minutes after he got home with his headphones on, and they would have no behavioral problems in the evening. Much of this is a vestibular issue. You know, he's resetting his brain when he does this. You know, I had a problem with my lab. I have a therapy lab, so I understand that really well. But I have a therapy lab, and he's getting older, and he had this real problem where he would fall down all the time. And I was like, I don't know what this is, and I called the vet. And the vet's like, well, it's a vestibular problem. And I'm like, oh, well, I know what that is. And I know how to treat that in kids, so let's try this with the dog, you know? So I picked him up and put him in the rocker and rocked him and spun him around, and he wasn't like too keen on it at first, but he got better. You know, so that's really what it's about, is just meeting those needs as they occur. DBT maintenance. One of the things that DBT therapists talk a lot about is maintenance. Keeping yourself prepared, lowering the initial threshold through physical preparedness. We know, for instance, that puberty, adolescence, the onset of the hormone rush is a real problem with any kiddo, let alone if they've already got all these sensory issues pounding on them. And you know, I've talked to young girls on my caseload, and all of them say, you know, when it's my time of the month, I have real problems. You know, I'm sensitive to everything. And that's that biocycle awareness. You know, we all go through biocycles. So being aware of what times of the month we're going to have problems with that kind of stress, big deal. Staying away from the caffeine that I'm addicted to, really good idea if you have anxiety problems. Getting enough sleep, diet, and exercise, we know from research, fundamentally changes the structure of the brain, helps us function, helps us produce the chemicals that are going to keep us calm and non-stressed. So this maintenance component of DBT, I think, is very strong too. And we talked about expanding the emotional window, bridging the gap from mindfulness to emotional awareness. We've talked about that quite a bit. And the use of emotion-focused therapies, I think, is something that could be advantageous later. Once you've settled all these other issues and the individual is able to self-regulate pretty well, then we can start doing things like working on emotional recognition. You know, I mean, a lot of the problem with high-functioning autism is basically, I don't understand that you're angry or bored by the fact I've been talking about military machinery for an hour. You know, because my mirror neurons don't work in my brain the way yours do. But that doesn't mean they can't work. That doesn't mean I can't account for the fact that they don't work. It doesn't mean I can't be trained to recognize that. You know, but again, we have to start slow, and I keep repeating that, and work on that kind of emotional sensory awareness and emotional integration once we get the other stuff in line. That is my presentation. Are there any questions? Yeah?
I have a good question. And maybe I don't know enough about DBT, but I always thought DBT was connecting behaviors to emotional response, or emotional responses to behaviors, and then in therapy looking at those emotional responses, because typically you're doing DBT with borderlines, and finding out that, oh, the emotional response is not really what's going on now, it's something that happened in the past.
Some of it.
Trauma.
That is a big component, but it started off as an offshoot of CBT, which was really about identifying thoughts that weren't working for you.
Right.
You know, and adaptive patterns that aren't working for you. And so that's where Marsha Linehan took up from there. But Marsha Linehan was also a very big proponent of psychodynamic theories.
But the DBT is different from DBT in the sense that you're looking at emotional responses to the past or past trauma. How would that pertain at all to somebody with Asperger, because their emotional responses aren't based on past traumas? It's, you know, it's based on lack of empathy.
No, but it feels very traumatic when the world is pounding on me from the outside.
But that's not what they're having.
And what we notice,
No,
I'm sorry.
Excuse me, I'm gonna challenge you on that.
Well, let me finish what I'm saying.
Personally, and for many people I know.
Well, what I would say is that DBT is not limited to trauma work. It's very effective in many fields. So it's not just, for instance, borderlines that it works with. It's also, and again, this is about the research being done and not having been done there. And it also, we're finding, works very well in the addictions field. where trauma is not always the case, that there's a lot of genetic components there. So I think that the problem is that in some part, your definition of DBT is too narrow. That it's really not just about trauma. That it is about expanding emotional awareness. And like I said, it is true that kids with Asperger's don't recognize emotion as readily or at all sometimes. The problem is that we've been told over and over and over and over and over by the experts that he'll never get emotional. Why? Yeah, he probably, it will take a lot of work. I sat in a meeting, for instance, one time with a 4-year-old child who was nonverbal, was not able to bathe herself, not able to dress herself, not able to do pretty much anything for herself, and had a team of experts at this center, which I do not mention enough, tell me that this child cannot be taught. I said, you know, I can teach my dog. I can probably teach this child. You know, what you're telling me is not that this child can't be taught, but that you're not really taking the time and the effort to teach her. She can't be taught within the constraints that you set down for her or for yourself. So I think that's where we're running into this, like, disconnect about emotional regulation. I do believe it's possible for people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism to learn to emotionally regulate. But the problem is, you're not going to learn that if the sensory stuff is bombarding you every 5 minutes. If you feel threatened in the world, if you don't feel safe, you have to feel safe first. I had a question back there.
Yes, you mentioned before you were recently on the radio debating between ABA and sensory treatment. I noticed my granddaughter, 6½, goes to a big ABA school in Manhattan, and they never recommend anything else other than ABA, and I think this is going to be a major controversy in the future. What would you do about it if it was your case?
Push for research.
Push for research.
And can I just mention, if you go to sinetworks.org, there's
Yeah.
a lot of research on sensory integration.
There is. There's more and more. Yeah. Yeah, there's more and more. And that's why when you hear the argument that it's not evidence-based, you can say, what is it? And here's the evidence.
My question is about when we sensory like eating. I've got 2 boys on my caseload that are now organ patients, and so we're really worried about their medical. But they can't feel it when they're full. And when they're not allowed to eat, they get aggressive. And now one is 11 and one is 13. Big is mom is single. Any thoughts about how to
Replacement behaviors is we have to find something that is going to replace that focus. How high functioning?
Thank you.
But they're both very verbal and capable of
That's a big problem.
so finding that replacement behavior and beginning to identify when I'm you know.
Well, that's wrong.
Identification of feeling full is really hard.
Yeah,
I can tell you this, okay? It is a learned habit, okay? You have to learn what that feeling is like. I didn't know it for years either, so.
Right. Right. Big problem.
All right, well, thanks for coming, folks.
Please fill out your evaluations. Thank you. Thank you.
And they don't recommend anything. Something's wrong.
You can look at it at the end of the day, and they will get the feedback to you.
Oh, okay.
Okay, they'll put it all together, and then just ask the person who's your person, and just say, can I ruffle through them, and then just look at them in case you're gonna do the talk again.
Yeah, that's
But
what
they
it's
will,
more
they will,
about feedback.
they will, you know, take all this data and put it together and send it to you.
That's great. Thank you.
said something about see Dorothy. Yes, you have to sign in and sign out the session. Asha. Ask Dorothy, just ask Dorothy, because Asha, thank you.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Very interesting.
It's such a small field right now. It's like, it's hard to do presentations like this here because people are looking for information, and he's like, well, I'm pushing to get more information. It's like, oh.
And then, you know, for me, and I see you're a special education person, I think, I don't want my kids out of my classroom, thank you, missing instruction
To do this.
to do this. So how then does the teacher take that and use strategies in her classroom, or his classroom? Are you a boots on the ground teacher or administrator?
I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher.
Yes.
Thank you. How do they do that without interrupting instruction?
Exactly.
So, you want to know, Paula Cluse has great stuff.
Paula Cluse?
Cluse. She's my favorite person on inclusive practices and joyful teaching.